Today we have a special session. We will be discussing about Sustainable Development Goals, so-called SDGs, that are important social priorities worldwide. For this purpose, we have a special guest. We are with leading economists and leading researchers from Russia and Bolivia. We want to thank to the Economic and Business Faculty of the Autonomous Gabriel René Moreno University in Bolivia for promoting this program, and we also appreciate the broadcast from the Channel 11 University Television, in Spanish, Canal 11 Televisión Universitaria. Before starting, we want to present our guest. I want to introduce to Andrei Sakharov. He is a research fellow at the Center for International Institutions, and we also have here to the Dr. Andrei Shelepov. He is also a researcher in Russian Presidential Academy of National Economic and Public Administration. Their research are related especially with sustainable development, international institutions, and global governance. We also have here to Dr. Martin Montero. He has a PhD in economics from West Virginia University. He is a professor in Liverpool University, Campus Shanghai, China. And his research interests are based on macroeconomics issues and developing countries. So Dr. Sakharov, Dr. Shelepov, Dr. Martin, for me, it's really an honor to be here with you. And obviously, we hope that we can, all of us, enjoy this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. And thanks for our guest for being here.
Given that said, we will introduce that Sustainable Development Goals are 17 global interconnected goals, as we mentioned before, called SDGs, that aim to achieve a better and more sustainable future for the entire world. The SDGs were adopted by the United Nations in 2015, and they are supposed to be reached by 2030. Indeed, one of the biggest challenges is to transform the international economic architecture to make global economic growth more inclusive. We will begin our conversation with some challenge questions explaining, first of all, what is the main difference between Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals? We wonder if they are the same or they are different. Perhaps the historical context in time can help us to understand the meaning of these terms. Dr. Sakharov?
Yes, thank you very much. Let me begin with saying that the MDGs, the Millenium Development Goals, were adopted in the year 2000, and they were scheduled to be completed by 2015. Obviously, well, they were not complete. And the main difference between the Sustainable Development Goals and the MDGs is that the MDGs dealt with such spheres as education, health, equality, food security, with a little bit of environmental goals as well. The SDGs, on the other hand, expanded upon those areas as well as added additional areas such as industrial policies, innovation, infrastructure, peace and justice, security, etc. So it retained the original core and expanded upon it, but with some major caveats. First of all, unlike the MDGs, the SDGs scope includes the issues of developed countries as well as the developing ones. It promotes this sort of whole of humanity and no one left behind approaches. So the problems within the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are perceived as universal, and they need to be tackled by comprehensive measures and by all the countries collectively. So one goal's attainment should not hamper the progress on other goals. So this is the main caveat. of the SDGs.
Okay, Dr. Shelepov, what do we have learned about Millennium Development Goals?
Well, actually, the reason behind transforming the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals was that there were a number of obstacles to achieving MDGs in time. Besides, as my colleague has already mentioned, these goals were aimed mainly on developing countries, while sustainable development is a global issue. So it was necessary to make development goals more country-owned and country-led. So in terms of the SDGs, each country is given the freedom to establish its own national framework concerning SDGs achievement. Although we have these globally agreed targets within all SDGs, each country has a kind of flexibility in terms of choosing areas which are corresponding to its national priorities and focus more on attaining these particular goals. This change in a shift to the country implementation and to particular numerical targets was made because MDGs faced difficulties in achieving the goals in time.
Okay, Dr. Montero, you want to say something about this first topic that we are talking about?
I would rather prefer to leave everything to the end because I'm getting a few questions. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you. We continue. Well, given this established difference between Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, perhaps, we have another question, and this is related on how is the world advancing in terms of no poverty, zero hunger, good health, and well-being. How is the world advancing in these terms?
So yeah, let me start, I guess. The advancement of the countries is obviously uneven, both in terms of, different countries have different results, and in terms of the scope. So they may be advancing in terms of environmental goals while failing in terms of socioeconomic targets and indicators. For example, our research this year and last year focused on the BRICS countries' performance in terms of the SDGs, and we clearly could see the picture when we studied the progress from 2015 to 2020, that, for example, Brazil was way ahead in terms of environmental targets and indicators, but it was very rapidly losing its advantage in terms of socioeconomic indicators. The amount of poor people increased, the amount of people in need of food security increased rapidly, while at the same time India, with a very low base on those socioeconomic indicators, showed a very rapid progress up until the year 2020. China also progressed very rapidly, with Russia falling somewhere in between. So our research obviously could not, due to the lag in statistics, and actually that statistics is another very important issue on this matter, which we can talk a bit later about. So due to the lag in statistics, we could not have researched the effects of the COVID pandemic, but they were devastating. So the UN admits that the pandemic threw the countries back, threw the whole humanity back for about 4 years, it states. And the progress on poverty eradication and hunger eradication is the most affected. So right now the world is off track, and most likely we will not be able to fulfill the Agenda 2030 by the said year, to 2030. So.
Okay, in the special case, talking about Russia, what are some limitations with these key indicators? Talking about, for example, gender equality, education, quality of education?
In terms of Russia, well, first of all, statistics is a very huge problem because, well, not only for Russia, but well, speaking about our country, with many indicators, is just that the problem is that the national statistical services do not work on the indicators which were developed by the UN committee. And that presents the issue when we try to actually get into the numbers, trying to figure out what's going on. But overall, Russia has a relatively high base in terms of education. Educational attainment is pretty high. The school expectancy, the years spent in school is pretty high in Russia. In terms of gender equality within the confines of educational institutions, it is also pretty well. There's also pretty good. There's almost no gender inequality in terms of education, and even in terms of income, the gap is very mild compared to some other nations. But I think the progress could be much quicker, and given that the short-term priorities of our country have shifted in the recent years and months, the quality of education and gender equality are not on the government's agenda to the extent they probably should be, ideally. So yeah, we do not expect a very rapid progress in those respects. But overall, well, if you want me to talk more about the global context, the issues with gender equality are somewhat culture linked. So in Russia, Russian culture is not very much opposed to embracing the women's rights, etc. And economic and socio-economic conditions were really conducive to the women's promotion in the workplaces and across the income distribution. But there are some countries, some areas, of course, where that progress may be impeded by cultural obstacles. But in time, I guess, with generational shift kicking in and education spreading, those problems will be resolved eventually.
Great. Perhaps one of the most difficult questions is the trade-off that exists between economic growth and environmental changes. Is it possible to achieve responsible consumption and green production? We mean, is it possible to get economic growth with, for example, lower emissions or perhaps with lower pollution? Is this possible? And obviously, how we can achieve this?
So, yes, of course, it is possible. Main issues here are, well, twofold. First of all, it's political will. and the issue of prioritization, which is the key to the whole scope of the Agenda 2030, because when it comes to prioritization, the government always has to choose between long-term priorities, long-term goals such as the SDGs, and the short-term disasters or political turmoils, or just having to face another election. For example, the fossil fuel subsidies is a great example in this respect, because the G20 has been pushing for the phase out of the fossil fuel subsidies for a long time, for more than 10 years already, and still this remains an issue. And in the countries such as Indonesia, for example, where the majority of the population depend for their livelihoods on the subsidized fuels to cook and heat their houses, perhaps. The government that would wish to go ahead with the phase out will face an immediate political backlash. So it might want to choose to make trade-offs, whether it wants to advance on the environmental goals, to reduce CO2 emissions, to provide stimuli to the population to reduce their use of hydrocarbons, or do they want to get elected on to not have a riot on their hands? So this is the main problem, I suppose. And another issue here which could help in the long run is the inevitable technical progress. Such technologies has eventually somewhere far ahead is the nuclear fusion could solve all our problems in that respect, even more effectively than the photovoltaic panels, solar energy, renewables, the traditional renewables, etc. So when we get to that point in history where we can just extract all the energy we want from nuclear fusion, then we will do away with this byproduct.
Any comment that you want to mention about this topic? Thank you. Dr. Shalepov, any comment that you want to make about this topic?
Well, I totally agree that new technologies and digitalization could contribute to achieving the goal of responsible consumption and production, and to lower emissions future. But still there is a huge risk of growing digital divide. And surprisingly, this problem is not so acute for developing countries. For instance, in China, India, or even in some African countries like Nigeria, we have well-developed digital ecosystems. So in India, for instance, creating a digital ecosystem which is aimed at covering all citizens is one of the government's top priorities. So these countries managed to cope with the issue of digital divide, while in some developed countries it still separates, for instance, the urban and rural areas and people living there, and it is almost the same poorer and richer parts of the population. So these new technologies, especially those focusing on electronic commerce, on electronic payments and other banking services, favor the rise of the digital urban consumer, while in rural areas some people are left behind the progress. So it's a huge problem that needs to be addressed.
Great. In 2020, the entire world has the experience with pandemic COVID-19. So if we remember, in most of the countries, we had lockdowns. Most economies inclusively had negative GDP growth rates. So how did the pandemic and the COVID-19 consequences impact the SDGs achievement? And perhaps what are the main challenges for sustainable economic growth? And also, what are the main challenges for decent work and reducing the inequalities? Dr. Sakharov, please, can you explain us these questions?
Yeah, despite the obvious that the pandemic had us all sitting at homes and reduced the productivity of labor, it also overloaded the healthcare systems, it affected educational attainment, and some people had to drop out of schools because they could not afford to go there anymore. They could not be there. It affected labor markets. So despite all that, the main effect and the toughest thing about the pandemic is that it did so in a very disproportionate manner. So it affected the poorest disproportionately more than it affected the top end of the distribution of income. So it exacerbated the inequalities, and it really pushed us back on the SDG 10, which is the fight against inequality. But despite all that, it also created unexpected stimuli for the development of the digital technology, as my colleague said, the application of said technologies into, across the board, across the whole range of the agenda in distance communication. So, for example, us speaking as we do, we very much owe that to the rapid spread of digital communication technologies in education, in telemedicine, in e-commerce. So that all created a very necessary push towards the long-term development of these spheres, which can in turn affect the outcomes for the developing nations and the most vulnerable countries and groups of populations, because with them embracing digital technology, digital skills, they can hit above their weight in terms of their income when they do.
Great. Dr. Martin, I don't know if you want to make any comments or you want to wait until the end of our conversation.
Well, yeah, I do have some comments, if you don't mind. I would like to throw them now, and then we can continue with the discussion. So I look at this as an outsider, right? Unlike Professor Shelepov and Professor Sakharov, I do not work particularly on this topic. So the question that I'm going to do is like a complete outsider. Both of you mentioned that there are some obstacles in reaching the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Like, for instance, COVID was one of it, but also the lack of data or the political will. So in this respect, when it comes to political will, what have you observed in terms of the size of the government? Have you seen that those countries with big governments tend to comply better with the Sustainable Development Goals? Or is it perhaps the other way, and small governments are more efficient on this?
Well, an interesting question. I think there is no direct correlation, but of course, having a large pool of resources does help. So, for example, if you're China and you have a large tax base and lots of resources to go around, of course, you can spend money on investing into sustainable infrastructure, expanding transport infrastructure, creating smart cities, promoting digital application, etc., etc. So you can also increase your investment in education, which is, I think, one of the key areas for everything concerning human development. So I would say yes, that if you're a huge economy, if you possess enough resources, of course you would tend to be more successful. But well, there may be another sort of point of view where you could say that if you you have a large pool of resources, you don't really have the need to expand it, and sort of that stifles the progress in some way or another, like the resource curse, something like that. Well, there could be different points of view on that.
Well, we will continue. I think that we have a little problem with the connective way. Perhaps one of the big difference between Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals is based on climate change. So if we think, what may be the key targets in combating climate change, and obviously what are the main challenges in achieving transition to climate neutrality?
Well, we may have partially covered that. The main challenges would be, first of all, the prioritization issue, where you could just put away those long-term climate goals indefinitely, dealing with this or that crisis which comes up every once in a while. And of course the technological development. So the main goals, I would say the main goals in terms of climate change, well, the climate issues are spread pretty evenly across the goals. So I think about 6 or 7 of the SDGs do have targets related to climate change or environment. Just out of the top of my head, I think the 6th one on water access has some sort of climate-related goal, about water ecosystems. The goal on energy, the 7th one, obviously does deal with energy efficiency and CO2 emissions. Eventually, the goal on smart cities and sustainable communities, the goal 11, also deals with the application of technology to make cities in our life, our neighborhoods, more sustainable. The goal 12 on sustainable consumption and production obviously does that too. And the main one, I think, being 7th, the energy one, the 13th, obviously, the one on climate action, which calls for the governments to develop their own strategies to deal with the climate change. And then the rest, the 15th, 16th goals, which deal with the environments of land and seas and oceans. What would be I think the recommendations? Once again, the improvement of education and raising awareness of the issues, obviously developing the national strategies in line with, the key thing with the national strategies is that they should not be aimed exclusively at dealing with climate issues, because as we know, the SDGs calls for the comprehensive approach, engaging the economic ministries, environment ministries, education, healthcare, etc. So it has to be a comprehensive single strategy to push with the implementation of the goals, not the separate ministerial strategies spread over.
Thank you, Dr. Sakharov. We want to ask for Dr. Shelepov, what is the role of institution, perhaps governance reforms about sustainable development goals? What is the role of international financial institutions in achieving sustainable development goals?
Actually, international financial institutions' role in achieving SDGs is it mainly relates two different roles of international financial institutions. The first one is their role as investors, so they can supply the investment needed to achieve sustainable development. But here we again face some challenges. For instance, if we speak about multilateral development banks, the main challenge is that their capital and investment they provide are not enough to achieve SDGs in time. There are different estimates, but an average one is that investment supply from multilateral development banks nowadays is 6 to 10 times lower than needed to achieve the goals by 2030. And some multilateral fora like the G20 try to address this issue, and there are two main focus areas here. The first one is related to the preferred creditor treatment for multilateral development banks. One of the most notable historical observation about multilateral banks is that loans they make to borrowers are always repaid. Still, credit rating agencies, despite this preferred creditor status, sometimes limits the opportunity of multilateral development banks to provide more resources. So obviously this approach should be revised. And another focus area is callable capital. Actually, largest multilateral development banks callable capital amounts to more than $1 trillion. But it has never even come close to being called upon by any of these banks. If the international community manages to make full use of MDB's callable capital, it can increase their portfolios very quickly by 2 or 3 times. So these are two main challenges that need to be addressed by international institutions if we want to enhance the role of MDBs as investors. And another role is for MDBs is acting as innovators. They can develop new financial products that encourage sustainable development. For instance, green bonds is a new instrument that can contribute to improving energy efficiency and thus achieving climate-related SDGs.
Thank you. Well, the time for this interview was really very short. We had many further questions. Dr. Montero, please. Dr. Montero, yeah. Please, if you want to highlight some comments or some final questions for this interview.
Yeah, I do have a final question. Thanks for the previous answer to my question, but this is like a sort of follow-up. It seems that in the last years, the power of the market has been neglected. And, you know, there could be some market solutions, for instance, to avoid the tragedy of the commons and eventually come up with something that decrease the pollution, for instance. So, on your own experience, because you already explained what is the role of the government. So, on your own experience, what do you think is the role of the market, like for instance, property rights, on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? Do you think, on what you have seen, on what you have studied, that government should try to look for more market solutions, or they should just try to control the market?
Well, given the nature of what I've said many times, that the key issue here is prioritization of long-term goals, I don't think the market is really the best tool to prioritize long-term goals, unfortunately. For example, if I was talking from my experience, I would say that we had discussions on how to implement the SDGs in Russia with the representatives of the private sector back in 2018, 19, all throughout the period, and they were really anxious to hear what they should do from the government. They said, we want the government to set the agenda, set the policies, set the conditions for us, and we want them to provide us with the means so that we can affect the situation. But some of them, the larger corporations, they really had their own plans on the SDGs, but to my mind, they were really discordant. They were focused on their particular area. For example, they were focused on reducing the impact of their activity. For example, mining, I don't remember what exactly. There was some mining, for example. They wanted to reduce the mining impact on the environment, let's say in Siberia. So they would do that. But that is not actually Sustainable Development Goals, because one misconception is that Sustainable Development Goals is all about environment, which it is not. It is about environment, social sphere, and the economics all put together. So if you deal with environmental impacts while neglecting the needs of the local community in terms of workplaces and so on, the results might not be very consistent with what the SDGs have in mind. So that puts me back to the private sector and the market. I don't think the market actors can really see the big picture and can really act in concert to promote the SDGs as it should be a concerted effort. So they sort of need the government to perhaps push them here and there, to direct them, to coordinate their activity. Unfortunately, as I would much rather prefer that there would be less government over
here. Dr. Sakharov, Dr. Shelepov, any final comments in order to highlight some idea or some general suggestion?
Andrei was right to say that there are some trade-offs between economic and, for instance, climate goals within SDGs themselves. So it leads to a trade-off in different stakeholders, policies, and priorities within SDGs. If corporations are always interested in getting profits, so and it's natural that they are focused on economic issues more. Governments are interested in having healthy and well-educated populations. So these goals can only be achieved through a combination of efforts from different stakeholders and finding a common denominator for their priorities. And again, here a good example is the sphere of multilateral development banks financing, where nowadays one of the top priorities is to make MDGs finance the Sustainable Development Goals, not themselves, but in partnership with private actors, leveraging more private capital and offering products that, on the one hand, contribute to achieving SDGs, but on the other hand, should be attractive for private investors in terms of their economic results. So governments and state actors should create a positive environment for achieving SDGs that takes into account the interests of all stakeholders involved in the process.
Okay, Dr. Sakharov, please, your main conclusions and policy suggestions.
Well, as for the policy suggestions, there would be to try and follow the spirit of the SDGs more closely than perhaps the latter of the SDGs, because there are many discrepancies in terms of the goals. There are many places in which the targets and the indicators have fallen behind of what's going on currently in the world in terms of peace and security, in terms of digitalization. So I would very much want to see the governments adopt comprehensive single strategies to achieve SDGs, and for them to not forget the core principles of whole of humanity and no one left behind principles.
Yeah, and given these rapid changes, these strategies should be constantly reviewed to take into account new factors like digitalization.
Dr. Shelepov, Dr. Sakharov, Dr. Montero, I really appreciate all of your comment and significant contribution. Please, we kindly invite you for another conversation again for the near future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Professor Shelepov and Professor Sakharov. It was very clear, and it really brought my understanding about the SDG. So have a nice weekend, and hope to see you again here in the future.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was our main conversation in this session, discussing some concerns about Sustainable Development Goals. Now we go to our institutional announcements, and we'll continue with our program, Business and Economics.